The entire week, Marissa had been leaving the house early and arriving late. Early and late enough to avoid Benji. It wasn't fear, she kept telling herself. She just didn't want to give in to the temptation he represented. It was bad enough that she couldn't stop thinking of him. So, she'd been packing a tote and going to the gym, then spending the rest of the day out. She was playing it safe. Patrick had been scheduled for a week-long conference. Marissa had been afraid that Benji would come to the house in the evening, but her fears had been unfounded. Every night, she'd wandered the house in a state of nervous arousal. She didn't want him to come, but at the same time, she wanted again. This suffocating need scared her. Nothing seemed to help. Marissa was anxious for Patrick to get home. She was hoping that a bit of romance would get Benji off of her mind. Thursday, as she'd unlocked the door, she'd found a note from him. It had been short and to the point. He'd stated that he would be in at noon the next day. Marissa had sighed with relief. She'd be able to enjoy her usual morning routine. Friday morning, she woke suddenly from a twisting dream. It had been Benji in her dreams. The house felt oddly still. Too silent. She had a strange feeling, a nagging sense of foreboding. Shrugging off the sense of unease, she slipped on her socks and running shoes, then grabbed a cap and sunglasses and walked out, locking the door behind her. Marissa gave herself entirely to the physical activity. She reveled in the heat of the day, the light breeze in the trees. Birdsong surrounded her, lifting away the earlier sense of wrongness. Her body moved, stretched, strove for every meter, every step. For her, running was like flying. When she came to the intersection with Benji Street, she could have rerouted. Instead, she strengthened her resolve and turned in, pounding up the punishing hill. Breath in rhythm with her feet, she kept her eyes down, focusing on the speckled black asphalt, until the hill eased off. Only then did she look up, her gaze darting over to the stately traditional house on the hill. She'd both dreaded and hoped to see him there, working in the yard, like he'd been doing during the beginning of the summer, before everything had changed. Benji wasn't there, though. The house looked quiet. Off to the side, the spot where he'd been working the last time she'd seen him here was cleaned up. He'd clearly finished his project. Marissa felt relieved she didn't have to face him, but she'd be lying if she wasn't also disappointed. With a mental sigh, she moved on, pounding her feet and pumping her legs through the rest of her run. She finished in a sprint at the mouth of her driveway. Lungs burning, she slowly paced up the drive, her arms and hands moving to keep the blood from pooling in her fingers. The day had warmed up considerably, and a sticky humidity had joined the heat, which meant that in short order, without the soft breeze generated while she ran, Marissa was entirely drenched in sweat. Letting herself in the side door that led into the mudroom, she released a quiet sigh at the temperature difference. Pulling a bottle out of the fridge, she opened and took a long, gulping draught. She was in a post-running daze, standing at the kitchen island with her second bottle of water while browsing news on her tablet. That's probably why she didn't hear him until she felt a hand cover her mouth tightly, while another pushed her forward, then down onto the island surface. Her water bottle went flying as Marissa screamed through the hand at her mouth. Adrenaline spiked through her blood and she fought harder, until her attacker spoke. "Good morning, Mrs. Weiss. I've been waiting for you." He whispered it into her ear. She recognized his voice. It was Benji. Suddenly, she felt entirely overwhelmed with warring emotions. Confusion, fear, arousal, anger, relief. "Benji, let me up," she mumbled into his hand, trying to push herself off the island again. He wouldn't let up, though. This time, as she struggled helplessly, she felt Benji press himself to her behind. "You've been a very naughty woman, Mrs. Weiss." Benji leaned over her. He chuckled darkly. "I'm going to remove my hand from your mouth. You aren't going to scream, are you?" Marissa shook her head as best she could, her dark eyes wide, trying to catch a glimpse of the man behind her. She felt more than saw the nod. Then his hand was gone and she was dragging in huge gulps of air. She said, "What the hell are you doing? Benji, let me go." It sounded like begging, so weak. Marissa struggled against the binding, but couldn't get loose. "You've been avoiding me, Mrs. Weiss. You deserve every spank you get for making me wait." Marissa whimpered and said, "Wait, Benji, this isn't right. We can't." "Shut up, Mrs. Weiss, or so help me God, I'll double it," growled Benji. Marissa was shocked into silence at his words, his tone. He sounded coldly determined. Leaning in, he nipped at her ear and said, "I think we need to take this somewhere more comfortable." Then he once again fisted her ponytail and led her out of the room ahead of him towards the stairs. Marissa's steps were jerky and clumsy as she walked. She was very aware of being directed through her house like so much chattel. Benji never asked which way to go, and it wasn't a small house. He just knew, and that made Marissa nervous. "How do you know where our room is?" The shame washed over her again. Ugly guilt nestled in the pit of her stomach. She had to stop this, no matter how good it felt. Patrick would never forgive her. Can you guess what happens next? Star. The sky was shot with reds and pinks, the beauty of a dying day. Marissa was so exhausted, but her still hummed in excitement. They'd spent the day exploring the limits, and she'd come in an unknowable manner of ways, until it had been time for him to go. He'd wanted one more thing though, and she'd been game. Right now, even with spittle dripping down her chin and her eyes streaming tears, she didn't regret any of it. Benji gripped her close. He laughed, then gave her a conspiratorial wink. "When's Patrick going to be home?" It took a moment for the words to filter through her brain. When she grokked his question, she felt the events of the entire day come crashing down on her as mountains of guilt. She stared wide-eyed and open-mouthed at Benji, unable to understand how she'd entirely forgotten that her husband was coming home in a matter of hours. The sun was nearly gone, so maybe his plane had already landed. He might already be in his car. On the way home. Panic filled her, and she said, "Oh God. Oh my God." Clutching at herself, Marissa doubled over as if someone had punched her. Benji made a tsking sound. "Don't worry, Mrs. Weiss. You have plenty of time." Marissa whimpered, tears brimming and falling down her cheeks. "How can you be this cruel?" "Why?" she asked, unable to understand his callousness. He cocked his head and watched her. Marissa shivered at the coldness in his gaze. "You're just a toy, Mrs. Weiss." He gave her a clear, guileless smile, then stood up and walked away. After a while, she stood up. Her mind refused to deal with the days just then. She needed to get cleaned up before Patrick got home.